Before we begin, if you believe respect should be earned, not demanded, then this is your story. Like, comment, and subscribe now so you don't miss the final chapters. Now, without further ado. The morning air at Buckingham Palace carried the kind of chill that made tourists clutch their coats tighter, while the Union Jack above the courtyard shifted gently in the breeze. London's grey sky stretched overhead like a canvas of tradition, unbroken, unmoved, eternal. Inside the palace gates, ceremonial guards stood rigid in a perfect row. Scarlet tunics, black bearskin caps, rifles at rest, eyes fixed forward. Not one blinked, not one swayed. At the northern post, near the edge of the diplomatic entrance, stood Corporal Nathaniel Brand. 36 years old, former Royal Marines, 3 deployments under his belt, and now in the 4th year of his ceremonial duty. A role often mistaken for show, but built on unshakable discipline. He hadn't moved in 18 minutes, but he knew what was coming. The French were late by 6 minutes. Not that anyone would say it aloud. Diplomacy made allowances. But Brand had read the schedule. He always did. Punctuality was a form of respect, and silence was his reply to its absence. The gates creaked. A sleek black convoy emerged through the arch, led by 2 motorcycles flanking a modest limousine. No flags, no visible security. But the quiet procession made clear this wasn't a tourist visit. President Emmanuel Macron had arrived. Brand's mind remained still, but internally his memory drifted. He had once stood on a rooftop in Kabul, watching a diplomat enter a building he knew wouldn't be standing in 30 minutes. He had been the last man out when the call came to evacuate a bombed-out aid station in Nigeria. He had once held a dying translator's hand for 6 minutes until backup arrived, and the translator's last words were, "Don't tell my wife I was scared." That was real silence. This was controlled stillness. He focused. A French voice echoed through the courtyard. Macron had stepped from the limousine, greeted by a palace official with a practiced smile. Photographers stayed back. This was a closed diplomatic session. No press. And yet, the moment would become unforgettable. Because Macron noticed him. Macron turned toward Brand with the narrowed gaze of a man used to commanding attention. He didn't smile. He studied. Then, with a half-smirk, he spoke in French to his aide, intentionally within earshot. "Still with the toys, I see," he said, glancing at Brand's rifle. "You'd think in 2025 they'd use something functional." His aide gave a polite, neutral chuckle. Brand didn't flinch. Macron stepped closer. Just close enough. "You don't blink, do you?" he asked, switching to English. His accent was light, but the condescension wasn't. "Tell me, does that come with the hat, or is it trained in?" Still nothing. "I wonder what would happen," Macron mused aloud, "if I whispered something truly scandalous in your ear. Would you react? Or does the Queen's training beat the humanity out of her soldiers?" Macron stepped even closer. Protocol permitted distance. He was already violating it. He leaned forward and spoke low, just above a whisper. "You know, in Paris, we call this theater. Actors in funny coats." Brand didn't twitch. "Impressive," Macron said. "Or tragic. I can't tell which." He turned away, clearly expecting the performance to be over. But the stage had only just been set. Inside, behind the stone facade of duty, Brand catalogued everything: Macron's inflection, the exact distance he had breached, the faint smell of expensive cologne, the way his left hand twitched when he said, "Impressive." It wasn't the first time someone had tested the mask, but few realized the mask looked back. He recalled his days in Marseille during joint training. He spoke fluent French. He had read Macron's early essays from his Sorbonne years. He knew this was a man who loved language more than silence, a man who used words as weapons. But weapons could misfire. In the inner chambers of Buckingham Palace, diplomats were already seated. Tea was served. Protocol was unfolding like clockwork. But outside, Macron loitered. He didn't follow the aide inside immediately. He glanced back at the guard post. There was something he hadn't shaken off. He returned. No cameras, no staff, just him, and the man who hadn't moved. Macron approached with a different tone now, less performative, more curious. "What's your name?" he asked. No response. "Fine, I'll name you then. L'homme de pierre, the stone man." He circled behind Brand briefly. "You know, you stand still very well," Macron said. "But I wonder, does your stillness mean approval or cowardice?" He paused behind the guard's left shoulder. "Or are you simply afraid to move, because once you do, you'll stop being a symbol and start being a man again?" A palace official emerged onto the courtyard, gesturing politely. "Monsieur le Président, we are ready." Macron ignored him for a heartbeat too long. He looked again at Brand. The silence was louder this time. Then, finally, he smiled. Not his usual tight press briefing grin, but something else, uneasy, almost uncertain. He walked inside. In the silence that followed, Brand's mind wandered briefly to a mission long ago in Lyon. A French intelligence liaison, Lieutenant Pascaline, had once told him, "Your silence is loud. It unsettles those who lie to themselves." He hadn't understood it then. Now he did. As the courtyard returned to its still rhythm, and Macron disappeared into the palace corridors, the tension remained like an echo. Something had shifted, and for the first time in a long time, Brand could feel it. This wasn't over. The man would come back. He couldn't help himself. He had touched something ancient, and it had not blinked. Macron entered the oak-paneled reception hall of Buckingham Palace with the graceful arrogance of someone who knew his presence changed the temperature of a room. He shook hands with diplomats, sipped tea poured into centuries-old china, and made casual remarks with carefully rehearsed spontaneity. But something tugged at the back of his mind. The man in the courtyard, the one who hadn't flinched. He'd stood in front of generals, tycoons, kings, and gotten responses. Sometimes outrage, sometimes deference, often both. But not this man. Not the silent stone of a British guard. Macron turned to a British envoy. "That guard," he said. "The one stationed outside, near the northern wing. What's his name?" The envoy blinked. Corporal Nathaniel Brand, I believe, served with distinction, Royal Marines, now with the Household Division. Macron raised an eyebrow. Marine? Not theater-trained? Decorated, the envoy clarified, and extremely professional. Macron took a slow sip of his tea. I see. But he didn't. Not yet. Meanwhile, Brand remained in place, still as a stone set centuries earlier. But inside, the echo of Macron's words still reverberated. You afraid to move? It wasn't a new accusation. He'd heard versions of it in whispers back in Helmand, men confusing control with fear. But what Macron didn't understand was that Brand's stillness wasn't inaction. It was defiance. Disciplined, deliberate defiance. He thought about Lyon again. The alley ambush and the fire. The decision to hold his position despite the screams for help, because protocol demanded perimeter coverage until evac arrived. A decision that saved 17 lives, including Pascaline's. He still remembered her final words to him in perfect French. You guard the world with silence. That's louder than most men's shouts. As the reception concluded, and guests prepared to depart, Macron stepped back outside without waiting for his security detail. The moment felt too unfinished, too unresolved, and sure enough, there he was, still standing. The same guard, same rifle, same silence. Macron exhaled slowly, then approached. This time, he didn't smirk. You've made an impression, Macron said softly. Did you know that? Nothing. I asked about you. They said you're a Royal Marine, that you've served in operations across Africa and the Middle East, that you speak French. Still no reaction. But you don't speak to me? Macron stepped within the edge of protocol again. I've met men like you, he continued. Men who believe duty means not reacting, who think stillness is strength. He paused. But sometimes, stillness is just a shield for shame. The words hung in the air like a blade, waiting to be drawn. Brand didn't flinch, but Macron saw it. The twitch of a tendon in the jaw. The flicker of something behind the guard's fixed gaze. And he knew. He'd touched a nerve. Flashback. Kabul. 2013. Dust everywhere. Brand pulling a wounded child out from rubble after an IED strike. His radio screaming for withdrawal. But he stayed. Held her hand. Until the medics came. Her last words had been in Arabic. But he'd understood. Don't forget me. Even when they say not to move. He had carried that moment in his bones, that choice, that reflex. And now, Macron's voice tried to overwrite it with doubt. Still nothing? Macron asked. Is that it? He leaned closer. What if I told you something only someone from Lyon would know? He switched to fluent French. You covered the North Perimeter in March 2017. I know. I was briefed when I visited the region. One of the children you helped survive is now in Paris, studying law. Her name is Samira. I met her last year. Still nothing from Brand. But Macron wasn't finished. "You're not just a guard. You're a witness, a survivor, a decision-maker." He leaned back, almost disappointed. "And yet, you hide behind this theater." Then he turned, started to walk. But this time, Brand moved. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. Just a simple adjustment of his stance. A single step to reposition his boot. A flick of his left hand to rest differently on the rifle. But it was deliberate, controlled, intentional. Macron froze, and Brand spoke. One line, in flawless French. "Silence isn't hiding. It's remembering." Macron turned slowly, and for the first time that day, he said nothing. Because nothing he could say would be louder than that. Inside the palace, an aide whispered to the British envoy, "Did the guard just speak?" "Yes," the envoy replied, not taking his eyes off the courtyard. "Yes, he did." That evening, Macron didn't join his staff for the post-visit dinner. He stayed alone in his suite, staring at a fireplace that wasn't lit, hearing a voice that had only said one line, but had shattered the performance of power. He took out his notebook, wrote 5 words. "Stillness can carry more truth." Then underlined it twice. Brand returned to Wellington Barracks after his shift. He undressed in silence, polished his boots, hung his rifle. Then, from a drawer, he retrieved an envelope. Inside was an old photograph, Samira, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, smiling. He looked at it for a long time, then tucked it back away. 2 weeks later, a quiet envelope arrived at Wellington Barracks, sealed in deep blue wax with the golden insignia of the French Republic. It was addressed simply, "To Corporal Nathaniel Brand, from the office of the President of France." Brand opened it alone, seated at the edge of his bunk, the letter opener trembling slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from precision. Inside, the message was handwritten. "We're preparing a tribute ceremony in Paris. I would consider it a personal honor if you would attend, in uniform, as a guest, not as a guard. E.M." There was no mention of their previous encounter, no apology, no pretense, just an invitation. 3 days later, Corporal Brand arrived in Paris, not through red carpets or official limousines, but on a quiet military transport, greeted by a French lieutenant with a polite bow. "Your presence was specifically requested," the officer said. Brand didn't respond, but the nod he gave was unmistakable. The Élysée courtyard was transformed. Dozens of French veterans, children of fallen soldiers, peacekeepers from multiple nations, and in the center of it all, 2 empty chairs. One marked President de la République. The other left blank, save for a small plaque that read, "Gardien du silence," Guardian of Silence. Macron arrived in full-dress uniform, an unusual break from tradition. He took his seat. Brand stood silently behind his chair. Macron stood at the podium and didn't speak. Not at first. 30 seconds passed, then 60. A full minute of silence. People shifted. Cameras panned. Murmurs echoed. Then Macron looked up. "When I first encountered the man behind me," he began, "I thought he was merely an ornament of tradition, a living statue, a protocol." He paused. "I was wrong." The air hung still. In an age where leaders speak endlessly, where every moment is broadcast, where noise is power, this man showed me that silence is strength. He turned. "Corporal Brand, your silence was a mirror I didn't know I needed." After the ceremony, Macron and Brand stood alone in a side chamber. "No press," Macron said. "No audience." He extended a hand. This time, Brand accepted. "You don't speak much," Macron said. "One line was enough," Brand replied, "and I haven't stopped thinking about it since." They stood in mutual stillness for a moment. Then Macron asked genuinely, "Do you think I've changed?" Brand nodded once. "But not enough?" Brand held his gaze. "You're asking the question. That's a start." Back at Buckingham Palace, a new rotation began. Brand returned to his post as though nothing had happened. But everything had. The other guards glanced toward him with something different now. Not curiosity, but understanding. Weeks later, a child in the courtyard, no more than 7 years old, looked up at the motionless Corporal Brand and whispered to his father, "Why doesn't he move?" The father smiled gently. "Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand still."